Chapter 17. Light Growing. Nobody can write about my life, for there is nothing on the surface. This remark of Sri Aurobindo, the exponent of life divine and the voice incarnate of India's soul, is equally true in respect of those who are universally regarded as world teachers. And among the great teachers of the world in our times, Swami Abhedananda certainly holds a unique position. His was no ordinary life of a monk or an ascetic or a philosopher. It was a light of truth that emanated from the perennial source of the highest spiritual realization. And as such, his biography must necessarily be a faithful account of an illuminated mind and a refined soul born of India's age-long spiritual sadhana, of which Sri Ramakrishna was the epitome. Events are not all important here. In the events that happen one after another and in every successive stage of his life must be viewed and interpreted only in relation to his inner life. And in the course of our narration, whenever we are required to touch the outer fringe of his life, we will do so only to make the narration more or less objective. The ideals and aspirations of such lives as those of Vivekananda and Abhedananda should be regarded as the most important, for they constitute the real landmarks of their life. Nothing is so insipid in the historical records of saintly men than to read about their superlative and superhuman excellence without any consideration for their inner life. In short, to get a clear and correct view of such great world teachers as Vivekananda and Abhedananda, we do not need to be told if their actions were good, but how and why they came to do such acts. It is not the aim or the intention here to set down the chronicle of Swami Abhedananda's life, nor to reveal the secret of his life, but only to behold a man in his full glory. His was a dedicated life for a great cause, whose magnitude has been seldom realized by us. He knew, as only a few world teachers knew, that it is not enough to give men things, you must give them yourself. And all know that Swami Abhedananda, as the messenger of his master's universal message of love, light, and faith, gave himself completely to the fulfillment of the great task for which he was born. Swami Abhedananda's days at the Baranagar monastery were not simply occupied with worship, study, or meditation. They were also the days of gathering the rich harvest of self-knowledge, which ultimately paved the path of his eminence as a world teacher, immediately after the passing away of his equally eminent spiritual brother and guide, the world-famous Swami Vivekananda. This self-knowledge he acquired through self-education, and that began at the monastery. Swami Abhedananda writes, "At that time, I began to devote myself to self-education and with the study of physics and psychology and philosophy. With Swami Vivekananda, I studied the Buddhistic philosophy as well as the principles of Advaita, or the non-dualistic philosophy of Vedanta. From Sri Ramakrishna, I learned that Advaita, that philosophy, leads in the search after the ultimate truth of the universe, which is one and absolute in Brahman, and that the search after truth ends in the realization of the oneness of the jiva, or individual soul, the jagat, the world, and Ishvara, God, the beloved, in Brahman, the absolute consciousness, as taught in Advaita philosophy of Vedanta, and that they are the different steps in the path of realization of the absolute truth of Brahman." This statement of Swami Abhedananda gives us a glimpse into his endeavor towards the path of self-knowledge, which really constituted the background of spiritual discipline that began initially at the feet of his master. The life story of Swami Abhedananda reveals to us that he knew that God had given him a word to speak and a work to do. The word was the spiritual message of India. He must have realized fully, as Vivekananda did, that since the advent of Sri Ramakrishna, India was rising to shed the eternal message entrusted to her over the world. He also believed that India has existed for humanity and not for herself, and it is for humanity and not for herself that she must become great. Thus inspired with this high mission, Kali Tapasi now turned into Kali Vedanti, devoting himself wholeheartedly towards self-education, and the period spent by him in the company with his brother disciples at the Brahmanagar Muth must have led to a decisive change in his conviction regarding his life's purpose. He knew that his guru was no ordinary guru, and he was not a disciple to remain wholly absorbed in silent meditation or passive inaction in order to reach the highest state of realization. As he used to sit in his daily practice of meditation, the master seemed to whisper into his ears, "You have another thing to do, and you have got to train yourself for my work." As the days went by, his spiritual training now developed not so much a matter of intellectual comprehension, rather as a fact of intimate realization, in which he obtained direct illumination of eternal truth. The new conviction must have presumably come to him through his discourses with Vivekananda in particular, who was also then preparing himself for the great task that awaited him. To spend life in complete retirement or to remain merged into the Supreme Spirit was never the intention of the disciples of Ramakrishna, at least not so in the cases of Vivekananda and Abhedananda. If his days at Brahmanagar were spent in learning and practicing the psychological discipline of yoga, those were at the same time occupied in the pursuit of self-knowledge that gave him the real strength for his future work and also helped him in perfectly visualizing the light growing within him. Thus, the monastery at Brahmanagar proved to him not only as a place for practicing austerity, but also it became to him the garden for spiritual culture. Here he laid down for himself a rigidly monastic life, spending the greater part of the day in devotion, study, meditation, and discourses on subjects mostly related to Western and Eastern philosophy. Altogether, the pursuits were most profitable and enjoyable. The period we are now dealing with relates to the maturity of Kali Vedanti's self-discipline and self-knowledge. To grow within, this was the burden of his spiritual exercises at this time. This inner growth meant to him to find out the right idea and the right way of harmony, to restate the ancient and eternal spiritual truth of the self, Atman, so that it shall permeate and dominate the mental and physical life, to develop the most vital and profound methods of psychological self-discipline and self-development, so that the mental and psychical life of man may express the spiritual life through the utmost possible expansions of its richness, power, and complexity, and to seek for the means and motives by which his external life and his society may remold themselves progressively in the truth and spirit and develop towards the utmost possible harmony of individual freedom and social unity. A traveler in the path of deeper knowledge, Abhedananda, during his stay at Baranagar Monastery, and afterwards as a wandering ascetic, must have conceived the development of man's intellectual power as our essential stage in the evolution of the human spirit, in its urge to seek a deeper knowledge, which appropriates the interpretation of the intellect and reconciles its distinctions in a concrete and developing unity. This deeper knowledge, according to Swami Abhedananda, is a mode of knowledge by identity, which he explains as a form of knowledge in which the experience of knowing is identical with the experience or enjoyment of the reality known. To know God is to experience Him. There is no other way. In all great religious thoughts, there has been throughout the ages a conviction regarding knowledge radically distinct from the conception of knowledge employed in scientific and logical procedure. The primary object of spiritual knowledge is God, whom man worships, the spiritual power in the universe that transcends man, yet operates in his life and experience. Man cannot know God by the understanding alone, remaining apart from him as an impartial spectator. He must enter into union with God, and this union must be complete, including a surrender of the feeling and will, as well as an act of the understanding. As union with the divine becomes more intimate, God becomes more fully revealed in the increasing richness and power of direct experience. In endeavoring to elucidate this trend of spiritual thinking on the part of Abhedananda during the second phase of his life, we might infer that as a true disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, he was never after a narrow religion, a sectarian religion, an exclusive religion, which lives only for a limited time and a limited purpose. In words of his own, he said, "That which we call the Hindu religion is really the eternal religion, because it is the universal religion which embraces all others, the Sanatana Dharma. This is the one religion that triumphs over materialism by including and anticipating the discoveries of science and the speculations of philosophy. It is the one religion which impresses on mankind the closeness of God to us, and embraces in its compass all possible means by which man can approach God. It is the one religion which insists every moment on truth, which all religions acknowledge, and that He, God, is in all men and all things, and that in Him we move and have our being. It is the one religion that enables us not only to understand and believe this truth, but to realize it in every part of our being." Thus, for Abhedananda, self-knowledge must emanate from the eternal truth and become incarnate in vital and creative experience. And this ever new, effective expression in the changing conditions of man's life. His self-knowledge taught him exactly what has been expressed by Professor Whitehead when he said, "Religion will not regain its old power until it can face change in the same spirit as does science." His principles may be eternal, but the expression of these principles requires continued development. And we know that in his later days as the spiritual leader, Abhedananda went beyond the strict interpretations of the scripture, initiating a new spiritual movement which swept the Western world immediately after Vivekananda was removed from the scene due to his premature death in 1902. When Kali Vedanti actually conceived during the days passed by at Baranagar and thereafter at the Alamazar Muth, and also in the course of his solitary sojourns for about a decade as a wandering ascetic, was no ordinary spiritual experience. He must have entered into the fuller experience which became manifest in his subsequent activities as a religious teacher and also as a religious preacher. What he actually aspired and finally realized through intense self-knowledge and spiritual discipline during the formative stage of his sadhana was the supreme truth, a truth of the infinite, diversity by which he appears to mean a truth of our inner unifying creative principles that have infinite expressions. Thus the light that began to grow within him was a living reality, not any abstraction, and this was likely for one who had initiation in spiritual training under Sri Ramakrishna. Thus, the light that grew in Abhedananda steadily and almost unseen by anybody at that time was about to illumine millions of souls in a manner which stands in comparison to none else except his spiritual brother, Swami Vivekananda.